The digital world has a way of making you feel both incredibly connected and terrifyingly vulnerable at the same time. For me, that vulnerability became a stark, horrifying reality in the summer of 2021. I was in the 7th grade, my life a whirlwind of navigating new friendships, crushing on boys, and trying to figure out who I was. My social life, like that of most kids my age, revolved around my phone and a popular social media app that was a hub for various online communities and fandoms. The app was a place where I could connect with people who shared my interests, a digital haven where I felt understood. But it was also a place with virtually no security measures, a digital Wild West where anyone could contact you and where danger could lurk behind any anonymous profile. That night, I was at a sleepover at my friend Jasmine's house. There were 4 of us in total, and we were celebrating her birthday. Her house was a large, modern home, but the real prize was the smaller guest house in her backyard. It was a single spacious room with a bathroom, a large TV, and several comfortable sofa beds. It was our own private clubhouse, a place where we could be loud and silly without disturbing her parents. We spent the first few hours of the night watching movies and playing the kind of ridiculous games that only preteen girls find amusing. Sometime after midnight, Jasmine, who shared my love for all things spooky, suggested we play some scary games. I was all for it. We decided to try the Bloody Mary ritual, a classic of sleepover lore. We turned off all the lights in the guest house and crowded into the small, dark bathroom. One by one, we stood in front of the mirror and chanted the name, our nervous giggles echoing in the small space. Of course, nothing happened. After the thrill of our failed ghost hunting experiment had worn off, we settled back onto the sofa beds, a movie playing on the TV in the background. I pulled out my phone and opened the social media app, scrolling through the various communities I was a part of. I was messaging a friend from one of the fandoms when she abruptly went offline. I figured she had just gone to bed and was about to put my phone away when a notification popped up. It was a direct message from an account I didn't recognize. The profile picture was a strange, distorted image that was impossible to make out, and the username was a jumble of random letters and numbers. I assumed it was just a bot, a common annoyance on the app, and I tapped on the chat, expecting to see some spammy advertisement. But what I saw was something far more sinister. The message was written in a strange, glitchy font, the letters distorted and almost falling out of the text bubble. It was a long, rambling message, a bizarre, cult-like chant that praised some strange, unfamiliar entity. The message was chilling enough on its own, but then I read the last few lines, and my blood ran cold. "He is close," the message read. "He is right behind the door. He is coming for you." I let out a nervous, shaky laugh and showed the message to my friend Amy, who was sitting next to me. Her reaction was not what I expected. Her eyes went wide with genuine fear. She showed the message to the other girls, and the light, giggly atmosphere in the room evaporated, replaced by a thick, heavy silence. We tried to rationalize it, to convince ourselves that it was just some edgy teenager trying to creep us out. And then we heard it. A soft, slow creak, followed by a single, distinct knock on the glass door of the guest house. The front of the guest house was all windows, including the door, and through them, we could see nothing but the inky blackness of the backyard, a stark contrast to the bright, colorful glow of the television screen. My phone buzzed in my hand with another message from the strange account. "We're here," it said, followed by another long, terrifying string of praises to the unnamed being. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a prank. One of the other girls had to be messing with us. But as I looked around at the pale, terrified faces of my friends, I knew that wasn't true. We were all in this together. Amy started to sob, and then I did too. In a moment of pure animalistic panic, we all bolted from the guest house, running blindly across the dark, dew-soaked grass towards the back door of the main house. We burst into the living room, our hearts pounding, our bodies trembling, and we huddled there in the bright, reassuring light for what felt like an eternity. I blocked the creepy account and deleted the app from my phone. Nothing else happened that night. but the memory of that terrifying, anonymous message and the knock that followed is a chilling reminder of the very real dangers that can lurk on the other side of a screen. I've spent a lot of my life feeling like I was on the outside looking in. Being both bipolar and autistic means that the world often feels like a language I can't quite speak fluently. When I was a kid, this social awkwardness made me an easy target, and I desperately craved a sense of belonging, of being seen and accepted. This is the story of how that desperation led me into the darkest, most traumatic period of my life. It began when I was 12, in the 7th grade. A friend introduced me to a girl named G. She was in the grade below me, but we were the same age. From the moment we met, she fixated on me. It was an intense, all-consuming attention. It was both flattering and deeply unsettling. We became super close, doing everything together. For a lonely kid like me, being the center of someone's universe was an intoxicating feeling. But even in those early months, there was a persistent underlying wrongness to our friendship. She was incredibly touchy, her hands always on me, and she was fiercely controlling, a possessiveness that I tried to brush off as just her love language. She was cold and dismissive to anyone else who tried to talk to me, effectively building a wall around me that left her as the only one inside. By the time I was in 8th grade, her behavior had escalated. We were both deeply into fandom culture and online role-playing, and she would use this shared interest as a weapon. At the lunch table, in the middle of our crowded, noisy school cafeteria, her hand would find my thigh, her fingers squeezing in a way that was anything but friendly. Then, she would ask me to role-play. I was always hesitant, but she was a master of coercion, using a combination of pleading and subtle threats to get me to agree. These weren't role-plays. They were a cover for her to molest me. She would force herself on me, touching my chest, kissing my neck, sitting on my lap, all while our classmates sat just feet away, oblivious. Afterward, she would act as if nothing had happened, or worse, she would blame it on my eroticism, a word that made me feel disgusting and culpable. I became used to it, tolerating the abuse because I was terrified of losing the only friend I thought I had. The abuse culminated at her slumber party at a local hotel. I sat next to her in the car on the way there, her hand on my thigh the entire time. In the hotel room, as everyone was getting ready to go to the pool, she asked me to come with her into one of the rooms. She shut the door and asked me to change with her in the bathroom. I was visibly uncomfortable, but I agreed, my child brain still not fully grasping the severity of the situation. I went into the bathroom and quickly changed, my back to her. When I spun around, she was standing there, fully exposed, a smirk on her face. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What?" "I thought it would be funny," she said, before laughing. I shuffled out of the bathroom, my heart pounding, my mind reeling, trying to process what had just happened. The rest of the sleepover was a blur of reckless, self-destructive behavior on my part. I ran down the hallways, banged on doors, screamed at the top of my lungs. I was trying to outrun the feeling of violation, but it was useless. The Monday after the party, she sat down next to me at lunch, a smirk on her face. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. "I want to have sex with you." I recoiled, staring at her in shock. She then proceeded to describe, in explicit, graphic detail, what she wanted to do to me, essentially describing rape. I was in a constant state of fear and confusion. She would say and do things to keep me in line, like telling me her mother didn't like me and that we couldn't hang out outside of school because of how I had acted at her party. She was a master manipulator, breaking me down and making it seem like I was the bad guy, like it was my fault she was touching me. A few months later, my friend group planned a trip to the drive-in theater. G was there, lying next to me in the dark. I had made it clear that I needed space, but she coiled her arms and legs around me, her breath tickling my neck. I will never forget the feeling of pure, abject terror that washed over me in that moment. I pushed her away and spent the rest of the night in the back of a different car, quietly crying. That was the night I started planning my escape. I had recently met someone new, a person who was kind and respectful, and who helped me realize just how toxic my situation was. I decided to ghost G when she angrily questioned me about it. I sent her a long, whining message, finally telling her how awful she was and that I never wanted to speak to her again. She responded with a barrage of threatening calls and voicemails. I blocked her number and deleted everything, something I deeply regret now. The years that followed were a blur of PTSD and a slow, painful process of healing. I have to live with what she did to me for the rest of my life. But I am finally starting to heal, and sharing this story is a part of that process. There are some people who are just off. They exist on a different frequency from everyone else, and there's an aura of unsettling quietness around them that makes the hair on your arms stand up. In my 6th grade language arts class, that person was Henry. This was back in 2019. Henry was a tall, unnervingly thin boy who always seemed to be folded in on himself, as if he was trying to take up as little space as possible. He never spoke unless a teacher called on him directly, and even then, his answers were clipped monosyllabic whispers. He didn't have any friends, and he seemed to prefer it that way, spending his lunch periods and recesses alone, reading books with dark, morbid-looking covers. Our language arts classroom was set up in 4 large clusters of desks. I was in a group with my best friend, Leah, and 2 other kids. Henry sat at the desk directly behind me. One afternoon, we were supposed to be doing a group reading assignment, but Henry, as usual, wasn't participating. He was hunched over his school-issued Chromebook, his face illuminated by the screen's glow. One of the other boys in our group, frustrated by Henry's lack of participation, finally snapped. He stood up, walked over to Henry's desk, and snatched the Chromebook out of his hands. "What are you even doing?" he demanded. As he looked at the screen, his face went pale. He didn't say anything, just stood there, his eyes wide with a mixture of disgust and horror. "What is it?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. He turned the screen towards us. Henry had multiple tabs open. They were all filled with graphic, clinical images of human anatomy. There were pictures of dissected organs, diagrams of the skeletal system, and close-up photographs of human bones, some of them showing signs of trauma or decay. In our sheltered, suburban 6th grade world, it was the most disturbing thing any of us had ever seen. But it wasn't the images that scared me the most. It was the look on Henry's face. He was smiling. It wasn't a normal smile. It was a slow, deliberate, and deeply unsettling grin, as if he was immensely proud that we had discovered his secret obsession. I felt a cold chill run through me as his dark, empty eyes landed on me. The smile never wavered. I was so upset, so completely creeped out, that I blurted out, "You need to do the work with the rest of us and stop being such a creepy freak." The words were out of my mouth before I could stop them. His smile vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, flat stare that he kept fixed on me for the rest of the period. I got a lecture from the teacher for my outburst, but Henry's silent, unwavering gaze was a far worse punishment. That Friday, Leah was spending the night at my house. We were both excited. We had plans to bake cookies and watch a marathon of our favorite fantasy movies. We got off the school bus and started the short walk to my house, our conversation light and cheerful, the incident with Henry completely forgotten. When we got inside, we kicked off our shoes and dropped our backpacks in the entryway. My golden retriever, Buster, was in his crate in the finished basement, barking excitedly as he always did when I got home. We were supposed to take him out right away, but we got distracted by the promise of snacks in the kitchen. As we were rummaging through the pantry, we both noticed that Buster had suddenly gone quiet. It was an abrupt, unnatural silence that was more unsettling than his barking. "That's weird," Leah said. "I'm going to go let him out." She headed for the basement door. She was halfway down the stairs when she suddenly froze, her body rigid. She didn't scream, just let out a sharp, choked gasp. I ran to the top of the stairs. "What is it? What's wrong?" I asked, my heart starting to pound. She didn't turn around. She just stood there, her back to me, completely motionless. "Get a weapon," she whispered, her voice tight with a terror that was so palpable it was contagious. I ran to the living room and, in a moment of pure panicked stupidity, grabbed a decorative throw pillow off the couch. Leah, however, had the presence of mind to go to the kitchen and grab the largest, sharpest knife from the butcher block. Armed with our ridiculously mismatched weapons, we slowly descended into the basement. We searched the entire space, our hearts pounding in our chests. We checked the small laundry room, the storage closet under the stairs, behind the old couch. There was no one there. Buster was in his crate, whining softly, his tail tucked between his legs. We were both relieved, but still completely on edge. "What did you see?" I asked Leah, my voice trembling. She looked at me, her face pale, her eyes still wide with fear. "I looked down here," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "and there was someone sitting on the floor in front of Buster's crate. They were just sitting there, with their back to me, messing with one of Buster's chew toys." The image she described sent a fresh wave of terror through me. We spent the rest of the night upstairs, with every light in the house on, jumping at every sound. The next day at school was a Monday. I was walking down the crowded hallway to my homeroom, still shaken from the weekend's events, when I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned around, and there was Henry. He was standing a little too close, his face devoid of any expression. "Hey," he said, his voice a low, flat monotone. "I thought you should know. I really enjoy crawling around in your basement. You have a really nice crawl space behind the furnace. It's very quiet." He gave me one last lingering look with his empty eyes, and then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the sea of students. I just stood there, frozen in the middle of the hallway, the blood draining from my face as the horrifying reality of his words washed over me. He hadn't just been in my house. He had been hiding there. The summer of 2020 was a strange, unsettling time for everyone. The world had been turned upside down, and the long, lazy days of summer vacation were tinged with a pervasive sense of anxiety and uncertainty. I was 14, and my best friend at the time, Ella, was my anchor in that sea of weirdness. We spent most of our days in a comfortable, repetitive cycle of watching movies and talking for hours. Our small, suburban town in North Carolina, usually a hub of summer activity, was quiet and subdued. The streets were emptier, the nights longer. It was on one of these long, quiet nights that Ella suggested we walk to the Shell station a few blocks from my house to get slushies and snacks. I was hesitant at first. It was around 11 at night, and my parents had always warned me about being out late. My town had a reputation as a hotspot for human trafficking, a grim reality that was a constant, low-level source of fear for all the girls in our community. But I pushed the paranoid thoughts aside. The gas station was only a half-mile away, a short, familiar walk down well-lit streets. What could possibly happen? We set off into the warm, humid night, our conversation a comfortable, familiar buzz. The Shell station was an oasis of bright, fluorescent light in the darkness. We wandered the aisles, picking out our favorite chips and candy, our only concern the difficult decision between a blue raspberry or a cherry slushie. As I was in the chip aisle, trying to decide between sour cream and onion or cheddar, I noticed a woman standing in the middle of the aisle. She was older, probably in her late 50s or early 60s, with a thin, severe face and eyes that were a little too bright, a little too intense. She wasn't looking at the chips. She was just standing there, staring directly at me. I felt a prickle of unease. I tried to ignore her, but I could feel her eyes on me as I grabbed my bag of chips. She was in my way, so I had to ask her to move. "Excuse me, ma'am," I said, my voice coming out a little weaker than I had intended. She moved aside without a word, but her eyes never left my face. I met up with Ella at the counter, and as we were paying for our items, I glanced behind me. The woman was standing in line behind us. She didn't have anything in her hands, no snacks, no drinks. I figured she was just buying cigarettes. We left the store, the little bell on the door chiming behind us, and started the walk back to my house, our slushies cold in our hands. As we were walking, we noticed a car behind us, a dark-colored Toyota Camry, driving incredibly slowly. It was keeping pace with us, its engine a low, menacing rumble in the quiet night. When we turned at an intersection, the car turned too. That's when the low-level unease I had been feeling blossomed into full-blown fear. We stopped walking, and the car stopped next to us. Ella, who was always braver than me, walked up to the passenger side window and knocked on the glass. The window rolled down with a soft, electronic whir, and my heart stopped. Sitting in the passenger seat was the woman from the gas station. Her face was a pale, emotionless mask in the dim light of the street lamp. Why is she in this car that's been following us? I thought, a wave of pure terror washing over me. Before I could process what was happening, the woman did something completely unexpected. She reached out of the window, her hand a blur of motion, and grabbed Ella's arm. Her grip was like a vice, her long, bony fingers digging into Ella's skin. She tried to pull her into the car. Ella screamed, a raw, terrified sound that was cut short as she was yanked off her feet. I reacted on pure instinct. I grabbed Ella's other arm and pulled with all my might. For a terrifying second, we were locked in a grotesque tug of war, with my best friend as the rope. I pulled harder, my feet slipping on the pavement, and finally, Ella's arm slipped from the woman's grasp. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. We ran like hell, the car speeding up behind us, its headlights a terrifying, blinding glare. I'm not an athletic person, but that night, I ran faster than I ever had in my life, fueled by a primal, life or death fear. We made it to my house, a blur of motion and panicked sobs, and burst through the front door, slamming and locking it behind us. In retrospect, we should have run to a neighbor's house, but in that moment, the only thing we could think of was the safety of my home. We expected to hear the car screech to a halt outside, to hear angry banging on the door. But there was nothing, just the sound of our own ragged, gasping breaths. We were so scared that we ran into my bedroom closet, huddled together in the dark, and we stayed there for the rest of the night, too terrified to even speak, until the first faint rays of dawn began to filter through the blinds of my window. When I was 15, my best friend was a girl named Sarah. We were practically attached at the hip, and I spent most of my weekends at her house. Her home was a sanctuary for me, a comfortable and familiar place. Sarah had 2 younger siblings who were a constant source of noise and chaos, and her mom was a single parent who worked long hours, so my house, with its relative peace and quiet, was usually our default hangout spot. But one particular weekend in the fall of 2022, I asked Sarah if we could have a sleepover at her place for a change. I was feeling a bit suffocated by my own parents and was craving a change of scenery. I had never actually spent the night at Sarah's house before, and I was excited about the novelty of it. Her mom agreed, mentioning that she would be working late and then going out with her boyfriend, so we would have the house to ourselves for most of the night. We went straight to Sarah's house after school on Friday. It was an older, 2-story house in a quiet, established neighborhood in our small Midwestern town. We dropped our bags in her room, then went downstairs to watch some television and figure out what we wanted to do for dinner. After a while, we decided to forage for snacks in the kitchen. Her kitchen had a side door that led out to a small porch, and the main door was one of those old-fashioned wooden ones with a screen door on the outside. As we were rummaging through the pantry, I happened to glance over at the door, and my heart jumped into my throat. There was a man standing on the other side of the screen, his face just inches from the mesh, looking directly into the kitchen. He was probably in his late 30s, with a grimy, unshaven face and greasy, unkempt hair. He was wearing a faded, stained t-shirt, and I remember wondering for a brief moment if he was homeless. He made direct eye contact with me, and a slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face, revealing a set of yellow teeth. Well, he said, his voice a low, gravelly drawl. "Hello there, young ladies." Sarah, who had her back to the door, turned around. A look of weary annoyance crossed her face. "Hi, Dave," she said, her tone flat. She told him that her mom wasn't home. The man, Dave, chuckled. "Yeah, I know," he replied, his eyes not leaving me. "She never is." "Who's your little friend here?" he asked, his gaze raking over me from head to toe in a way that made me feel incredibly exposed and uncomfortable. Sarah told him I was her friend and that we were just hanging out. She was clearly as uncomfortable as I was. Dave just stood there for a moment, that creepy smile still plastered on his face. "So," he said, leaning against the doorframe, "are boys allowed?" "I'm sure a couple of cuties, like you have some boyfriends coming over." I could feel my skin crawling. Sarah, sensing my distress, told him that she had to watch her younger siblings for the night and that her mom would be home later. I knew this was a lie. Her siblings were with their dad for the weekend, and her mom had no plans of coming home until the next day. Dave didn't seem to believe her, but he didn't press the issue. He just stood there, smiling at us for another painfully long moment. "Oh, well," he finally said, "I guess you can just tell your mom I stopped by. See you later, sexy ladies." He gave us a final lingering look before turning and shuffling away. As soon as he was gone, I turned to Sarah. "What was that all about?" I asked, my voice shaky. She explained that Dave was her next-door neighbor. Apparently, her mom had gone on a single disastrous date with him a few years ago when they had first moved in. According to Sarah, her mom had found him to be cheap, with poor hygiene and overly forward, aggressive sexual demeanor. Since then, he had made it a habit to stop by frequently, always trying to talk to her mom, always flirting with her in a way that made everyone in the family uncomfortable. Sarah also mentioned that in the last year or so, he had started to pay more attention to her, making disgusting comments about her developing body and suggesting that she should come over to his house to sunbathe in his backyard. I was horrified. What an absolute creep. We tried to shake off the unsettling encounter and get back to our evening. We ordered a large cheese pizza for dinner, ate junk food, and watched our favorite shows, trying to create a sense of normalcy. It was getting dark outside, and we were starting to relax. Not even 10 minutes after the pizza had been delivered, there was a knock at the front door. We both froze. It was after 9 o'clock at night, and we weren't expecting anyone. Sarah got up and cautiously approached the door, peering through the peephole. She immediately recoiled, her eyes wide with fear. She looked back at me, put a finger to her lips, and mouthed the word, "Dave." There was another knock, this time more insistent, followed by his voice, muffled through the door. "Girls, I know you're in there," he called out. We were paralyzed with fear. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "I know you're all alone in there. I saw you got a pizza, and I thought you might be hungry for some sausage." He chuckled, a low, guttural sound that was filled with grotesque innuendo. We remained completely silent. After a few more minutes of knocking and calling out to us, he muttered something about us being stuck-up little girls, and then we heard his footsteps retreating. We immediately went around the entire house, closing all the blinds, drawing all the curtains, and checking and rechecking that every single door and window was locked. We were so scared that we turned the volume on the television down to a barely audible whisper and kept only one small, dim lamp on in the corner of the room, terrified that any light or sound would attract his attention again. By around 10:30, we were fed up with sitting in the near darkness, prisoners in our own home. Sarah crept over to the front window and peeked through a small gap in the blinds at Dave's house next door. She reported that all of his lights were off. We reasoned that he had probably either gone out for the night or gone to bed. Feeling a little more secure, we turned on a few more lights and put on some music, trying to reclaim our night. We were sitting on the piano bench in the dining room, which was situated in front of a large set of windows, when we heard a sharp tapping sound right outside on the glass. We both whipped our heads around. I guess we had only closed the shades on that window halfway, because there, peering in at us, was Dave. His face was pressed up against the glass, his features distorted. He held up a six-pack of beer, a sickening grin on his face. "I know your mom's not home," he said, his voice slightly muffled by the window. "You should let me in so we can all party together." That was the final straw for Sarah. She jumped to her feet and screamed at him, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and rage. "No, leave us alone." Dave's expression changed instantly. The creepy smile vanished, replaced by a cold, blank look. "You know I can just come in, right?" he said, his voice flat and menacing. Sarah, thinking quickly, yelled back at him that she had just gotten off the phone with her mom and that she was calling the police. That seemed to do the trick. Dave started to back away, holding his hands up in a placating gesture, saying he was just kidding and that we needed to calm down. Sarah stood her ground, watching him until he had retreated all the way back to his own house. Then, she immediately called her mom's boyfriend's house. She told her mom everything that had happened, but her mom, to our utter disbelief, didn't seem to believe us. She thought we were exaggerating, making things up for attention. She told us to just go to bed and that everything would be fine. We ended up locking ourselves in our mom's upstairs bedroom for the rest of the night, not getting a wink of sleep. After that night, we went back to having all of our sleepovers at my house. I've always been a bit of a skeptic. Even as a kid, when my friends were terrified of the monster under the bed or the ghost in the attic, I was the one looking for the rational explanation: the branch scraping against the window, the house settling, the wind whistling through a crack in the frame. This logical, almost stubborn, part of my personality is probably why I became such good friends with Chloe. She was my complete opposite. Chloe lived in a world populated by spirits, specters, and signs from the great beyond. Our friendship, which began in the 3rd grade, was a strange but perfect balance of her imaginative flights of fancy and my grounded, scientific curiosity. She would tell me about the auras she could see around people, and I would explain the science of light refraction. She would talk about the whispers she heard in the wind, and I would point out the Doppler effect from a passing car. Her most constant companion in this spiritual world was a girl she called Eliza. According to Chloe, Eliza wasn't a figment of her imagination, but the ghost of a young girl who had attached herself to Chloe years ago. She described Eliza with a startling clarity that always unnerved me a little. Eliza had long, dark hair, sad, gray eyes, and always wore a simple, slightly tattered white dress. She was shy, Chloe would say, and often felt lonely. I never knew how to respond to these stories. Part of me felt a deep sense of pity for my friend, believing she had created this elaborate companion out of a deep-seated loneliness. Another, smaller part of me, the part that secretly enjoyed the ghost stories we'd watch on TV, couldn't help but be a little intrigued. Our friendship continued this way for years, a comfortable dance between her supernatural beliefs and my gentle skepticism. Then came the sleepover in the fall of 2016. I was in the 5th grade, and it was my turn to host. My family lived in an old sprawling house in the historic district of Savannah, Georgia. It was a beautiful home, a 2-story relic from a bygone era, with high ceilings, creaky hardwood floors, and the kind of deep, musty smell that old houses collect like memories. It also had a basement, a place I actively despised. It wasn't a finished modern basement. It was a dark, damp cellar with rough stone walls, a cracked concrete floor, and a single bare light bulb hanging from a cobweb-choked wire that did very little to push back the oppressive darkness. The air down there was thick and cold, and I always had the distinct feeling of being watched whenever I had to venture down to fetch something from storage. That night, Chloe and I had made a fort of blankets and pillows in my living room, and were working our way through a stack of movies. Predictably, Chloe had chosen a selection of paranormal investigation shows. As we watched a team of experts wander through a haunted asylum, their night vision cameras cutting through the darkness, Chloe got a look in her eye that I knew all too well. It was her ghost hunting look. "We should go to the basement," she said, her voice a hushed, excited whisper. "The energy in this old house is amazing. I bet Eliza loves it down there." I immediately protested. The last place on earth I wanted to be at 10 o'clock at night was in my creepy, dark basement. Chloe was persistent. She pleaded and cajoled, telling me we would only be down there for a few minutes. Finally, not wanting to be a bad host or a coward, I reluctantly agreed. Armed with Chloe's ghost hunting kit, her mother's old point and shoot digital camera, we made our descent. The wooden stairs creaked loudly under our weight, each step echoing in the cavernous space below. The air grew colder and damper with every step, and the familiar earthy smell of the cellar filled my nostrils. I pulled the string for the single light bulb, and the basement was cast in a sickly yellow glow, the shadows in the corners seeming to writhe and dance. "She's here," Chloe whispered, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. "She's a little scared, but she's excited we came down to see her." I just nodded, wrapping my arms around myself, trying to ward off a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. We sat down on an old, dusty couch that was pushed against one of the stone walls. Chloe then turned to me, her eyes shining. "I want to take a picture of you with Eliza," she said. "So you can finally see her," I sighed. It was a silly, childish game, but I knew it was important to her. "Okay, Chloe," I said, forcing a smile. "Where is she?" Chloe pointed to the empty space on the couch cushion right next to me. "She's sitting right there," she said, her voice completely serious. "She wants you to put your arm around her so she doesn't feel scared." A cold, prickling sensation traced its way down my spine. The air next to me suddenly felt heavy, dense. I dismissed it as my imagination, my mind playing tricks on me in this creepy environment. I took a deep breath and awkwardly put my arm around the empty space, the springs of the old couch groaning under the imaginary weight. "Okay," I said, my voice sounding strained to my own ears. "Take the picture?" Chloe raised the camera. The flash was a sudden, blinding burst of white light that made me see spots. I immediately jumped up and ran over to her, eager to see the photo and prove, once and for all, that there was nothing there. We both huddled over the small 2-inch screen. My heart, which had been pounding in my chest, seemed to stop altogether. The picture was perfectly clear. I was there, sitting on the couch, my face frozen in a fake, slightly pained smile. My arm was wrapped around thin air, but the air wasn't empty. Hovering in the space right next to me, nestled in the curve of my arm, were dozens of small, glowing orbs of white light. They weren't dust particles. They were too bright, too defined. They seemed to shimmer and move, clustered together in a vague, ethereal shape that was hauntingly, unmistakably human-like. I couldn't speak. I just stared at the screen, a wave of cold dread washing over me. This was impossible. It wasn't logical. Chloe, however, was in a state of rapturous awe. "I told you," she breathed, her voice filled with reverence. "That's her. That's Eliza." We both scrambled up the stairs, our feet slipping on the wooden steps, and burst into the kitchen where my mom was reading at the table. "Mom, look," I yelled, thrusting the camera into her hands. She took it, a bemused smile on her face. "That's a nice picture, sweetie," she said, glancing at it briefly. "No, Mom, you have to look closer," I insisted, my voice trembling. Her smile faded as she brought the camera closer to her face. I watched as the color drained from her cheeks, her expression shifting from mild amusement to a pale, wide-eyed horror. "Where?" she said, her voice a tight, strained whisper. "Did you take this picture?" "In the basement," I replied. She was silent for a long, heavy moment, her eyes locked on the image on the screen. Then she looked at me, her face grim. "I never wanted to scare you," she began, her voice low. "But strange things have been happening in this house ever since we moved in. I've heard whispers when no one else is home. The other day, a music box on the mantelpiece started playing by itself. She told us that a few weeks ago, she had been in the basement and had heard the distinct sound of a little girl humming a sad, simple melody. She had run out, terrified, and had never gone back. The rest of the sleepover was a torturous exercise in fear. We didn't sleep a wink. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old house was Eliza wandering the halls. We lay in my bed, huddled under the covers, listening to the sounds of the night, no longer skeptical, just terrified. The small town in Oregon where I grew up had a kind of deceptive tranquility. It was the sort of place where everyone knew everyone, and the most exciting thing that happened was the annual county fair. We all lived under the comfortable illusion of safety, a belief that bad things only happened in big cities, far away from our quiet little corner of the world. That illusion was shattered for me one cold autumn night in 2022 when I was 15. I was having a sleepover with my friend Jenna. We had spent most of the day just hanging out, sharing gossip, and watching cheesy rom-coms. Sometime in the evening, we decided to walk over to our other friend Leah's house, which was about a mile away on the other side of town. Jenna's mom was hesitant at first, saying it was too late, but we managed to convince her. The walk to Leah's house was one we had made 100 times before. We took our usual shortcuts through dimly lit alleys and across the backyards of sleeping houses. The air was crisp and smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. On the way, we stopped at a small 24-hour gas station to buy snacks and drinks. The fluorescent lights of the store felt unnaturally bright after the darkness of the streets. There was a lone cashier behind the counter, a tired-looking man who barely glanced up from his phone as we paid for our items. We continued on our way, and when we finally got to Leah's house, we were greeted with the warmth and comfort of a familiar place. We spent the next few hours watching movies and talking, the events of our short journey there completely forgotten. Jenna had convinced her mom to let us spend the night at Leah's, so she needed to call her to let her know. She had forgotten her phone at home and asked to use mine. I reached into my purse to grab it, but my fingers met only the smooth fabric of the lining. It wasn't there. A frantic search of my bag confirmed my fear. I had left it at the gas station. I remembered setting it on the counter when I was paying. I was so annoyed at myself. Leah, being the good friend that she was, offered to walk back with me to get it. We bundled up in our jackets and headed back out into the cold night. We retraced our steps, the town now feeling eerily quiet and deserted. We arrived at the gas station, and I asked the cashier if he had seen a phone. He nodded, reached under the counter, and produced my phone, a look of mild amusement on his face. I thanked him profusely, and we started the walk back to Leah's house. That's when we noticed the truck. It was a gray, older model pickup with a dented fender and a layer of grime that suggested it hadn't been washed in years. It was driving slowly down the street behind us, its headlights cutting through the darkness. At first, we didn't think anything of it, but when we turned onto a side street, the truck turned too, its engine a low, menacing rumble in the quiet night. We picked up our pace, a nervous energy starting to build between us. The truck kept its distance, a constant looming presence in our periphery. We made another turn, and so did the truck. It then pulled over to the side of the road, and our hearts stopped as two men got out. They were just silhouettes against the glare of the headlights, but their size and the deliberate way they moved were incredibly intimidating. We didn't wait to see what they wanted. "Run!" Leah hissed, and we bolted. We ran across the street, our feet pounding against the cold asphalt. We scrambled through a thick hedge that bordered someone's backyard, the thorny branches scratching at our faces and arms. We ran through a series of interconnected yards, our only goal to put as much distance as possible between us and the men. We could hear them behind us, their heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush. We finally found a place to hide, a dark, narrow space under a low wooden deck in someone's backyard. We squeezed ourselves in, our bodies pressed against the cold, damp earth. We held our breath, listening. We could hear the men in the yard, their voices low and angry as they searched for us. The beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the yard, getting dangerously close to our hiding spot. Then, after what felt like an eternity, we heard them give up. They left the yard, their footsteps retreating back towards the street. We stayed hidden for another 30 minutes, too scared to move until we were sure they were gone. We finally crept out from under the deck and, staying in the shadows, made our way back to Leah's house. We didn't tell her mom what had happened until the next morning. She called the police, but there was little they could do. We couldn't give them a license plate number, and our description of the men was vague. They were never found. We don't talk about that night anymore, but it changed something in us. The comfortable illusion of safety we had lived with our whole lives was gone, replaced by the chilling knowledge of what can lurk in the shadows of a quiet town. The summer I turned 17 was a whirlwind of sun-drenched days and long, humid nights. My friends and I lived for the weekends, and that particular Saturday in July of 2024 was supposed to be the highlight of our summer. It was our friend Brianna's birthday, and she was having a pool party and sleepover at her house. Her parents had a large, comfortable trailer parked in their driveway, and they had agreed to let us sleep out there so we wouldn't wake them up with our late-night chatter. The party was everything a teenage party should be. Loud music, a bonfire, and just enough drama to keep things interesting. By the time 3 in the morning rolled around, we were all exhausted and ready to retreat to the relative quiet of the trailer. The trailer was cozy, with a small kitchenette, a tiny bathroom, and a set of bunk beds in the back. My friend Reese and I claimed the top bunk, while the other girls settled into the beds below. The party had wound down, but Reese was still wide awake, her mind buzzing from the sugar and the excitement of the night. She was lying on her stomach, looking out the small window at the top of the bunk, which had a clear view of the quiet suburban street. Suddenly, she sat up. "Hey, look at this," she whispered. I rolled over and looked out the window. A teenage boy was walking quickly down the sidewalk, repeatedly looking over his shoulder with a panicked expression on his face. A few yards behind him, another, larger teenage boy was following him, his pace deliberate and menacing. Reese, who had had a little too much to drink and was feeling a surge of protective bravado, decided to intervene. She slid the window open and started yelling random, nonsensical things at the boy who was following, trying to scare him off. He stopped, his head snapping up towards the trailer, a look of confusion on his face. He had heard her, but he couldn't see where the voice was coming from. Scared that she had drawn attention to us, Reese quickly and quietly slid the window shut and ducked down beside me. After a minute of tense silence, her curiosity got the better of her. She cautiously peeked over the windowsill again. My heart stopped. The guy was no longer on the street. He was now standing at the edge of the driveway, right in front of the trailer, his head tilted as he tried to pinpoint the source of the noise. He was big, with broad shoulders and a thick neck, and even from a distance, he looked angry. He started walking slowly towards the trailer, his eyes scanning the windows. "Don't freak out," Reese whispered to me, her voice trembling. "But he's right outside." I sat up and looked. He was wandering around the trailer now, his dark silhouette a terrifying presence just a few feet away from where we were lying. I scrambled down from the bunk and whispered to the other girls, who were now all awake, that there was a guy outside. We all huddled together on the bottom bunk, our earlier feelings of joy and celebration replaced by a cold, creeping fear. The man was getting closer to the door. We could hear the crunch of his footsteps on the gravel of the driveway. Our friend Mackenzie, who was the smallest but also the most fearless among us, decided to keep watch, darting from window to window, giving us a whispered play-by-play of his movements. At one point, she peeked out the small window that faced the garage and let out a small gasp. He was standing right there, just on the other side of the thin wall, so close she could only see his legs. We all held our breath, praying he wouldn't try the door. After a few more minutes of what felt like an eternity, he seemed to give up and walk back to the middle of the street, where he stood for a moment, just looking at the house. We all started to breathe a collective sigh of relief, thinking he was finally gone. Mackenzie decided to take one last look out the window. Her face went pale. "He's on the front porch," she whispered, her voice filled with a new wave of terror. He was standing on the front steps of Brianna's house, as if he was contemplating going inside. We were trapped, helpless, just a few yards away in our metal box. We could only sit there in the dark, silent and terrified, and wait. He stood on the porch for what felt like an eternity before he finally turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the street. We didn't get any sleep that night. The next morning, Brianna tried to check her family's security cameras, but the feed from the previous night was gone. The cameras had been disconnected. We had no proof of what had happened, just the shared terrifying memory of the man who had stalked us in the dark. I have never been the type of person to believe in ghosts or anything supernatural. I have always been a firm believer in logic and science, always looking for a rational explanation for things that go bump in the night. I think it's important to state this up front, because I want you to understand just how profoundly real and unexplainable this experience was for me. It is the one event in my life that I have never been able to blame on the wind, or my eyes playing tricks on me, or an overactive imagination fueled by exhaustion. It was none of those things. It was something else entirely. When I was 12 years old, back in 2018, I had a sleepover planned at my best friend Maya's house for a Friday night. Maya lived in a huge old Victorian house that had been in her family for generations. It was the kind of house that seemed to have a life of its own, with creaky floorboards, drafty hallways, and a faint lingering scent of old wood and dust. We always slept in the downstairs living room during our sleepovers, so we wouldn't wake her parents who slept upstairs. This living room was enormous. On one side, there were two large overstuffed couches, a television, and a pool table. On the other side of the room, a good 20 feet away, stood a massive dark wood bookshelf with large glass cabinets. The bookshelf was filled with old leather-bound books and what looked like old files from her dad's work. I had asked Maya about the books once, but she had told me that the cabinets were always kept locked because her dad said there was important paperwork inside. That night, after watching a couple of movies and talking for hours, it was around midnight when I decided to go to the upstairs bathroom to brush my teeth. Maya was still downstairs, setting up our blankets and pillows on the couches. I made my way up the creaky staircase and into the bathroom. It was a large cold room with black and white checkered tile and an old clawfoot tub with a shower curtain. As I stood at the pedestal sink, brushing my teeth, I glanced up at my reflection in the large ornate mirror that hung on the wall. In the reflection, I could see the glass shower door behind me, and that's when I saw it. It was a shadow, but it was darker and more defined than any shadow should have been. It was the distinct outline of a small boy standing inside the shower. There were no features, no face, just a transparent but somehow solid-looking shape. Despite the shock of seeing it, I didn't feel threatened. In fact, I felt a strange sense of calm, almost a feeling of safety, but I was still completely freaked out. I whipped my head around to look at the shower directly. Of course, there was nothing there. The shower was empty. I shook my head, convinced I was just seeing things. I turned back to the mirror, and there was nothing. I took out my contacts, my vision blurring slightly, and looked back up into the mirror one last time. And there it was again. The same shape in the same exact place, just as clear as before, even with my not-so-great vision. I was officially terrified. I left my toothbrush and contact case on the sink and ran out of the bathroom, not wanting to spend another second in that room. I flew down the stairs and told Maya what I had seen. I couldn't help it. I started crying as I tried to explain the shadow in the mirror. I was trying so hard not to make a big deal out of it, but it had looked so real. I must have been making a lot of noise, because Maya's mom came down the stairs to see what was going on. Maya told her that I had seen a shadow in the bathroom. Her mom looked at me with a strange, distant expression in her eyes. "In the shower?" she asked, her voice quiet. I nodded, my tears still flowing. Then, she and I said the same exact words in unison. Did it look like a boy? My face went completely white. How could she have known that? Her mom then said, in a voice that was barely a whisper, "I've seen him before, too. There's nothing to worry about." And with that, she turned around and went back upstairs as quickly and quietly as she had come down. She didn't try to comfort me or offer any further explanation. She just left me there, more terrified than ever. Needless to say, I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in my sleeping bag, my eyes wide open, listening to every creak and groan of the old house. I must have finally dozed off sometime around 2 in the morning, because at exactly 3 o'clock, I was jolted awake by a loud bang. It sounded like it had come from right next to me, a sharp, cracking sound like a heavy book being dropped flat on the hardwood floor. I was too scared to move, too scared to even look. I pulled my blanket up over my head and eventually drifted back into a restless sleep. I woke up the next morning before Maya. The room was filled with the soft gray light of dawn. I sat up and looked down at the floor next to me, almost completely forgetting what had happened the night before. Lying there on the floor, right by my head, was a huge, old, leather-bound photo album. It was open. I looked over at the massive bookshelf on the other side of the room. One of the glass cabinet doors was slightly ajar. I guess they weren't always locked, like Maya had said. My mind struggled to make sense of it. There was no way that heavy album could have fallen 20 feet across the room and landed so neatly next to my head. The album was open to a page with a single black and white photograph on it. It was a picture of a little boy sitting on a set of swings, a look of pure, unadulterated joy on his face. It hadn't clicked for me yet. At breakfast, I told Maya's mom what had happened, about the loud bang and the photo album appearing next to me. She looked at the photo, and her face went completely white. "Who is that?" I asked, pointing to the boy in the picture. Maya's mom looked at me, her eyes filled with a deep, profound sadness. "That's my brother," she said softly. "He died in an accident when he was 6 years old. He loved to play hide and seek in this house. He always said the bathroom was the best hiding spot." I have always thought that some of the most terrifying moments in life are the ones that you can never fully explain. This particular experience has been lodged in my mind for the last few years, a persistent memory that refuses to fade. It was an incident from 2023, and even now, recalling the details sends an involuntary shiver down my spine. It was a Friday in late October, the kind of day that feels like a reward after a long week of school. The air was crisp, and my two closest friends, Ben and Leo, and I were walking home, buzzing with the typical energy of teenagers released from their academic cages. We were mapping out our weekend plans, throwing around ideas for movies and video games. It was Leo who suggested the sleepover at his place. His parents were going to be out of town visiting his aunt, and we would have the house to ourselves. Ben and I readily agreed. We split up at the end of our street, promising to meet up in a couple of hours. I went home and quickly packed a duffel bag with the essentials: a change of clothes, my toothbrush, a sleeping bag, and my phone charger. My parents were fine with the plan, knowing Leo's family well. After getting the green light, I shot a text to our group chat, and within minutes, we had a solid plan to meet at the small park just down the street from Leo's house. The walk to the park was short, only about 10 minutes, and the evening was starting to turn cool. A light drizzle had begun to fall, making the streetlights cast hazy halos on the wet pavement. When I arrived, Ben and Leo were already there, tossing a football back and forth under the dim park lights. We exchanged greetings and walked the remaining short distance to Leo's house. We made ourselves at home in the living room. Leo's bedroom was on the smaller side, barely big enough for one person, let alone 3 teenagers with sleeping bags and backpacks. The living room was spacious, with a large sectional sofa, a big screen television, and a sliding glass door that led to the backyard. We spread our sleeping bags out on the plush carpet, ordered a couple of pizzas, and settled in for a night of video games and junk food. The hours flew by in a blur of laughter, shouting at the television and recounting funny stories from school. Outside, the light drizzle had intensified into a steady downpour, the sound of the rain drumming against the roof and windows providing a cozy, insulating soundtrack to our night. Sometime after midnight, probably closer to 1 a.m, the combination of pizza and the late hour began to take its toll. Ben was the first to succumb, his trash talking in the game becoming incoherent, muttering as he drifted off to sleep. Leo and I tried to start a movie, but he was out cold within the first 15 minutes. I told myself I should probably get some sleep too, but my mind was still racing. I shut off the television, plunging the room into near complete darkness, save for the faint ambient glow filtering in from the streetlights outside. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and tried to get comfortable, staring up at the unfamiliar patterns of shadows on the ceiling. Sleep just wouldn't come. I tossed and turned, my body tired but my brain stubbornly awake. After what felt like an hour of fruitless effort, I quietly unzipped my sleeping bag, careful not to wake my friends, and padded into the kitchen for a glass of water. The house was silent except for the rhythmic drumming of the rain and the soft snores coming from Ben and Leo in the living room. As I stood at the kitchen sink, sipping my water, I heard a noise. It was faint at first, almost lost in the sound of the storm outside, a soft, irregular tapping sound. I froze, straining my ears to identify it. My first thought was that it was just a tree branch scraping against the side of the house in the wind. But as I listened more closely, the sound seemed to have a deliberate quality to it, a steady rhythm that was just a little too consistent to be random. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the living room. I placed my glass on the counter and crept back towards the room, my bare feet silent on the cool tile floor. I stood in the doorway, my eyes slowly adjusting to the darkness. The tapping was clearer now. It was coming from the large window on the left side of the room, the one that faced the front yard. My heart began to beat a little faster. I took a few cautious steps into the room, navigating around my friend's sleeping forms. As I got closer to the window, another sound emerged from the symphony of the storm. It was the soft, raspy sound of breathing. It was slow and deep, and I could just barely hear it over the rain. It was a sound that did not belong. The window was covered by a set of blinds, obscuring any view of the outside. I stood there, rooted to the spot, a cold fear creeping up my spine. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but finding none. I backed away from the window slowly, a frantic energy seizing me. I rushed over to my friends and shook them awake, my hands trembling. "What is it? What's wrong?" Leo mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. I pressed a finger to my lips, urging them to be quiet, and whispered for them to just listen. But as soon as they were awake and alert, the sound stopped. The tapping ceased, and the only sound was the rain. "Dude, I don't hear anything," Ben said, clearly annoyed at being woken up. I quickly and quietly explained what I had heard. The rhythmic tapping, the slow breathing just on the other side of the glass. They exchanged skeptical glances. Leo suggested that I had probably imagined it, that I was just tired and the storm was playing tricks on my ears. I insisted it was real. Frustrated, Ben finally said, "Fine, and let's go check. You'll see there's nothing out there." Driven by a need to prove I wasn't crazy, I agreed. I told them to come with me, so they could see for themselves. I unlatched the front door as quietly as I could, the click of the lock sounding deafeningly loud in the silent house. The three of us slipped outside into the cold, damp night. The rain had subsided to a light mist. We tiptoed over to the living room window and looked. There was nothing, just wet grass and the dark, empty street beyond. "See? I told you," Leo said, a hint of smugness in his voice. We stood there for a moment, the cold seeping into our clothes. I was about to concede, to admit that maybe I had imagined it all, when Ben suddenly stiffened. "Wait," he whispered, his voice tight with nervousness. "Who's that guy over there?" We followed his gaze. A few houses down the street, standing perfectly still under the flickering glow of a lone streetlight, was the silhouette of a man. He was just standing there, motionless, facing our direction. From what I could make out, he was about average height and was wearing a dark, hooded raincoat that obscured his features. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air ran through me. My friends looked at me, the disbelief in their eyes replaced with dawning horror. This was real. The man then did something that turned my blood to ice. He started to laugh. It wasn't a normal laugh. It was a low, guttural sound that seemed to bubble up from his chest, a sound completely devoid of humor. In that moment, a primal instinct took over. "The backyard gate," I hissed. Now, we began to back away slowly, our eyes fixed on the figure. Suddenly, without any warning, the man broke into a dead sprint, charging directly at us. The world seemed to shift into slow motion. We turned and ran, our feet slipping on the wet grass. The gate to the backyard was only a few feet away. Leo got to it first, fumbling with the latch. Ben scrambled through right after him. I was the last one in, and I slammed the heavy wooden gate shut just as the man collided with it from the other side. The impact was so forceful, it shook the entire structure. The gate held. It was a tall, sturdy fence, and he couldn't possibly climb it quickly. He began to bang his fists against the wood, screaming at us, his voice a horrifying roar of pure rage. "Come on out, you little brats, I'll kill you," he yelled. The words forever burned into my memory. We didn't wait to hear more. We sprinted to the back door, burst into the house, and immediately ran to wake up Leo's father, who had returned home early without us knowing. He grabbed a heavy flashlight and bolted outside, yelling at the man who was already running down the street. Leo's dad called the police. They arrived a short time later, their flashing lights painting the neighborhood in surreal strokes of red and blue. They searched the area but found nothing. The man was gone. The only thing they discovered was a long, sharp kitchen knife lying in the wet grass right outside the living room window, exactly where the tapping had come from. That summer of 2024 was one of the hottest on record in Colorado. I was 15, and my days were a blissful, repetitive cycle of sun and chlorine. My group of friends and I were inseparable. We all lived in the same sprawling suburban development, a neighborhood of identical houses and manicured lawns. Every morning, we would meet at the community pool, our towels and sunscreen in tow. There were 6 of us in total. Chloe, whose house was our usual meeting spot, her friend, Mia, Sophie, a guy from our grade named Liam, and me. We would spend the entire day at the pool, from the moment it opened until the lifeguards blew their final whistles at 9 o'clock at night. Our parents were all friends, a tight-knit community of transplants who had found each other in this new development, so they were comfortable with us spending so much time together. On this particular day, the heat had been especially brutal. As the pool closed, none of us were ready for the fun to end. We decided to have a sleepover at Chloe's house. Her place was perfect for it. She had a massive finished basement that her father, a professional musician, had soundproofed years ago. It was our own private world, completely cut off from the rest of the house. We piled into Chloe's mom's SUV for the short drive back to her place. When we arrived and walked inside, we were hit with a blast of cool air conditioning. As we made our way to the kitchen to gather snacks, we saw Chloe's stepfather, Marcus, sitting at the kitchen island, nursing a beer. None of us were particularly fond of Marcus. He had this unsettling way of looking at us, a little too long, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He would make comments that were just on the edge of inappropriate, things that made our skin crawl, but were subtle enough that we could never really call him out on them. He greeted us with his usual slick charm, and we offered polite but brief responses before grabbing armfuls of chips, soda, and candy and retreating down the stairs to the basement. The basement was our sanctuary. As soon as you walked down the stairs, to the right was a small kitchenette and a workshop area. To the left was the main living space with a huge sectional couch, a big screen television, and a pool table. Past the pool table was a short hallway with a bathroom and a storage closet on one side and a spare bedroom on the other. We all smelled strongly of sunscreen and pool water, so we decided to change and wash our hair. We split up, some of us going into the bathroom and others into the bedroom. None of us wanted to be alone in any of the rooms. We had all had strange, unexplainable experiences in that basement before. faint whispers and feelings of being watched that we had always dismissed as our imaginations. Chloe had a collection of her dad's old, oversized band t-shirts that we all wore as pajamas. After we had all changed and taken turns washing the chlorine out of our hair in the tub, we congregated in the spare bedroom. We piled onto the queen-size bed and the floor, making bracelets, talking about the upcoming school year, and binge-watching the latest season of a popular sci-fi show on a laptop. After a few hours of this, sometime around 2 in the morning, Liam had fallen asleep on the bed, his soft snores adding to the quiet hum of the laptop fan. The rest of us were sitting on the floor, whispering and laughing. Chloe was in the middle of a story when we all heard it, a distinct creak from the wooden stairs at the top of the basement. We all fell silent, our eyes wide, looking at each other in the dim light of the laptop screen. Chloe whispered that it was probably just one of her cats. But before she could finish her sentence, we heard another series of slow, heavy footsteps descending the stairs. A palpable fear settled over the room. Mia, who was the oldest among us, quietly got up and crept to the bedroom door, locking it with a soft click. Sophie and I moved to turn off the laptop, but we left it open, the faint glow of the screensaver providing the only light in the pitch-black room. We waited, holding our breath, for what felt like an eternity. The only sound was our own frantic heartbeats. Then, we heard the soft, sliding sound of footsteps shuffling across the carpeted floor of the main basement area, moving slowly towards the hallway where our room was. Chloe and I grabbed onto each other, our knuckles white. After another 2 minutes of complete silence, we all crawled from the floor onto the bed, huddling together around the sleeping Liam. The movement woke him up, and he sat up abruptly, his voice loud in the silent room. "What the hell are you guys doing?" Mia quickly clamped a hand over his mouth, her eyes wide with terror, and whispered what was happening. Liam, who was always skeptical of our paranormal theories about the basement, rolled his eyes and told us all to chill out. He slid off the bed, walked to the door, and unlocked it before we could stop him. He swung the door open, ready to prove to us that we were all just being paranoid. But the sight that greeted us made every single one of us freeze. Standing there in the dark hallway, his large frame filling the doorway, was Marcus. He was just standing there, completely silent, his face shrouded in shadow. The only thing we could see clearly were his square glasses, which reflected the faint light from the laptop, obscuring his eyes and making him look like some kind of terrifying, faceless creature. A collective scream erupted from all of us. Liam, his bravado instantly evaporating, slammed the door in Marcus's face and locked it again, scrambling back onto the bed and into the safety of our huddle. We stayed as silent as possible, listening. We could hear Marcus on the other side of the door, his voice a low, soft, and deeply unsettling whisper, asking if he could come in and join us. Sophie and I started to cry silently, tears streaming down our faces. Chloe, her hand shaking, managed to find her phone and call her mom, who was asleep upstairs. She spoke in a choked whisper, telling her mom that Marcus was in the basement and was trying to get into the bedroom with us. It felt like we waited for hours, but it was probably closer to 30 or 45 minutes. We heard the muffled sounds of Chloe's mom talking to Marcus, and then the sound of his heavy footsteps retreating back up the stairs. After a while, all was silent again. Exhausted and terrified, we eventually fell asleep, piled on top of each other on the bed, finding a strange comfort in our shared proximity. We were woken up the next morning by a soft knock on the door. It was Chloe's mom. We unlocked the door and let her in. She looked exhausted and distressed. She explained to us that after she had gotten Marcus back upstairs, he had told her something that made her feel sick. He had said to her, "So many young girls down there in that dark, soundproof basement, all by themselves. It's really dangerous. Anything could happen, and no one would hear a thing. It's a good thing those boys were down there with them, and that they were smart enough to lock the door." The moment she said those words, a wave of nausea washed over me. I looked around at my friends, and I saw the same look of pure, unadulterated horror reflected on all of their faces. The implication of his words was terrifyingly clear. We all packed our bags in silence and went home. I was never a particularly social kid. While other guys my age were out playing sports or going to parties, I was usually in my room, lost in the digital worlds of my video games. I had a small circle of friends, but I was most comfortable in my own company. So, when my friend Daniel invited me to a sleepover at his new house in the early spring of 2024, I was a little hesitant. But he was my best friend, and he had just moved into this massive old house on the outskirts of town, bordered on 3 sides by a dense, dark forest, and he was desperate to show it off. I packed my bag and my parents dropped me off that Friday evening. Daniel's house was impressive, but also undeniably creepy. It was a 3-story colonial, set far back from the road, and the trees in the backyard seemed to crowd in on it, their branches like skeletal fingers scraping against the windows. We headed straight for the basement, which was a vast, partially finished space with concrete floors, a single bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling, and a damp, earthy smell that clung to the air. It was the perfect teenage hangout spot. We spent the next few hours playing video games on a huge projection screen, the sounds of virtual gunfire and explosions echoing off the stone walls. Sometime around midnight, exhausted and bleary-eyed, we called it a night. We unrolled our sleeping bags on a large area rug in the center of the room and quickly drifted off to sleep. I woke up at exactly 2:17 in the morning. I know the exact time because I glanced at my phone. I had been woken up by a sound from upstairs. It wasn't a loud noise, just a soft, heavy thud, as if someone had dropped a heavy box on the floor directly above us. I lay still, my ears straining in the darkness. I tried to wake Daniel up, shaking his shoulder. "Dude, did you hear that?" I whispered. He groaned, swatting my hand away. "Shut up," he mumbled, and immediately started snoring again. I tried to go back to sleep, but my mind was wide awake. The house was settling, I told myself. It's an old house, but the sound had felt too deliberate, too solid. About 30 minutes later, I heard it again. This time, it was a series of thuds, followed by a slow, heavy scraping sound, like a piece of furniture being dragged across the hardwood floor. My heart began to pound in my chest. Then, I heard the slow, heavy tread of footsteps moving across the floor above me, heading towards the basement door. A moment later, the door at the top of the basement stairs began to creak open. It was an agonizingly slow sound, a drawn-out, high-pitched groan that seemed to go on forever. I watched in terror as a thin slice of absolute blackness appeared in the doorway, a darkness that was somehow deeper and more complete than the shadows of the basement. Panic seized me. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and looked for a place to hide. My eyes landed on a small closet built into the far wall under the staircase. I pulled the door open and squeezed myself inside, pulling it shut behind me. The closet was small and cramped, filled with old coats that smelled of mothballs and dust. I crouched down in the darkness, my knees pulled up to my chest, and tried to control my breathing. Through a small slit between the closet door and the frame, I had a narrow view of the basement. I could hear the slow, deliberate footsteps descending the wooden stairs. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed. I waited and waited, but nothing happened. The footsteps stopped and the basement fell silent. Exhausted from the adrenaline and the fear, I must have dozed off, my head slumping against the rough wood of the wall. I woke up an hour or so later to the sound of breathing. It was close, right outside the closet door. It wasn't normal breathing. It was a deep, wet, ragged sound, like someone with fluid in their lungs was struggling for every breath. I felt a wave of pure, unadulterated terror wash over me. I slowly lifted my head and peered through the slit in the door. And that's when I saw them. 2 small, glowing embers in the darkness, about 4 feet off the ground. They were red, a deep burning crimson, and they were staring directly at me. They were eyes. My stomach felt like it was going to explode. I clamped both hands over my mouth to stifle the scream that was clawing its way up my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that when I opened them, the eyes would be gone. But when I dared to look again, they were still there, unblinking, unmoving, just watching me. I crawled as far back into the closet as I could, pressing myself against the cold stone wall, trying to disappear into the darkness. I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, my eyes locked on the two glowing red dots, my body trembling uncontrollably. I don't know how long I was in there, but eventually, the first faint rays of dawn began to filter through the small basement window. As the room slowly brightened, the red eyes faded until they were just gone. I waited until the basement was filled with the gray light of morning before I finally mustered the courage to open the closet door. The basement was empty. Daniel was still fast asleep in his sleeping bag. I didn't say a word to him. I just packed my bag, and when his parents came downstairs, I told them I was feeling sick and needed to go home. The memory of those red eyes, burning in the darkness, is something that will never leave me. I never went back to Daniel's house again. It was August of last year, during that final sweltering week of summer vacation before the grim reality of school started up again. I was 13, an age where the world feels both infinitely large and claustrophobically small at the same time. My best friend Maya and I were trying to squeeze every last drop of freedom out of those last few days. We had been at her house all day, and as evening settled in, a deep, humid dusk that promised no relief from the heat, we decided to walk to the local fish and chip shop for dinner. It was a ritual for us, a small act of independence that felt monumental. Our house was in a quiet, leafy suburb, just outside of London, a place where the biggest excitement was usually a neighbor getting a new car. As the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement, we started our walk. We were listening to music on my phone, sharing a single pair of earbuds, the tinny sound a private soundtrack to our journey. We were about halfway to the shop, walking along a road that ran parallel to a large community park when I first saw it. Parked on the side of the road, right next to the children's playground, was a plain white work van. It was old and slightly rusted around the wheel wells, with no company logo or markings on its side. There was a man sitting in the driver's seat. He looked to be in his mid-40s, with thinning, greasy hair and a pale, fleshy face. He was just sitting there, his window rolled down, staring directly at us. When he saw that I had noticed him, a slow, unpleasant grin spread across his face. It was a predatory smile, all teeth and no warmth. He gave a small, deliberate wave. I nudged Maya and pointed him out. At first, we just thought he was a weirdo, another strange character in the vast landscape of London. We laughed it off nervously and kept walking. A few seconds later, I glanced back, and he was still staring, the same sickening grin on his face. This time, he didn't wave. He just watched. We picked up our pace, an unspoken urgency now fueling our steps. We got our food at the chip shop, the familiar, comforting smell of salt and vinegar doing little to ease the growing knot of anxiety in my stomach. We joked about the man in the van on our way back, calling him a creep. Our laughter a little too loud, a little too forced. We were trying to convince ourselves that it was nothing. As we approached the park again, our jokes died in our throats. He was still there. The white van was parked in the exact same spot, a silent, menacing presence against the backdrop of the now empty playground. As soon as he saw us, that same grotesque grin returned. This time, we didn't look back. We just started walking faster, our eyes fixed on the street ahead. I heard the sound of an engine turning over, a low rumble that made the hair on my arms stand up. The van pulled away from the curb and began to slowly, deliberately drive behind us. I told Maya what was happening, and I could feel her start to tremble beside me. The van sped up slightly until it was driving right alongside us, its speed perfectly matching our brisk walk. The man leaned across the passenger seat, his voice a low, oily drawl that was barely audible over the sound of the engine. "What's in the bag, girls?" he asked. "Where are you two headed?" We ignored him, our hearts pounding in our chests. My phone was nearly dead, so calling for help wasn't an option. Maya whispered in my ear, her voice tight with panic, that she was going to make a run for it at the end of the road. There was a sharp corner that a car wouldn't be able to take at speed. She told me to come with her. For some reason, I froze. In that moment of pure terror, a strange, defiant calm washed over me. I told her I was just going to keep walking. It was a stupid, irrational decision, born out of a bizarre mix of fear and a refusal to show fear. She took off, her feet pounding against the pavement as she sprinted towards the corner. Now that I was alone, the man in the van focused all of his attention on me. He kept pace with me, his questions becoming more personal, more insistent. How old are you? Where do you live? You shouldn't be out so late by yourself. I kept my eyes forward, my knuckles white as I clutched the warm paper bag of chips. I just pretended he wasn't there. My refusal to engage with him seemed to anger him. He sped up, swerving the van in front of me, blocking the entire sidewalk. He kept the engine, the sudden silence deafening. I was trapped. He took off his seatbelt and started to open his door. That's when my self-preservation instinct finally kicked in. I broke into a dead sprint, dodging around the front of his van and racing towards the corner where Maya was waiting. We both ran, not daring to look back, until we were safely hidden behind the brick wall of a garden. We peeked around the corner and saw that he had gotten out of his van and was standing in the middle of the road, looking around for us. After a moment, he seemed to give up, got back in his van, and drove away. We waited until his taillights had completely disappeared before we bolted the rest of the way back to Maya's house. We burst through the front door, gasping for breath, and told her mom everything that had happened. She saw the genuine terror in our eyes and knew we weren't lying. She asked if we had gotten his license plate number, but in our panic, we hadn't even thought to look. She decided that we needed to go back there with her and try to find him, to get his plate number for the police. I was terrified at the thought of going back, but I knew she was right. As we walked back towards the park, my stomach twisting into a tight knot, I couldn't believe my eyes. The man and his creepy white van were back. He was parked in the same spot, next to the children's playground, just watching the few kids who were still there playing in the twilight. When he saw us approaching, he got out of his van and started walking towards us, a menacing look on his face. But when he saw that we were with an adult, he stopped, his demeanor changing instantly. He turned around, got back in his van, and drove away as if nothing had happened. We called the police, but by the time they arrived, he was long gone. I thought that was the end of it, but a few months ago, I was scrolling through a local news website, and I saw a story that made my blood run cold. It was about a little boy who had been followed home from school by a man in a white van in the same neighborhood, right near that same park. The description of the man and the van matched perfectly. He's still out there, and he has never been caught. The summer I turned 14, in 2022, I was sent to spend the entire break with my aunt and cousin, Maria, in their small suburban home just outside of Tampa, Florida. The heat that summer was suffocating, a thick, humid blanket that never seemed to lift. My days were a monotonous cycle of sitting in front of the air conditioner and watching television. So when Maria told me that we had been invited for an extended sleepover at her friend Sophia's house, I was ecstatic. It was a chance for a change of scenery, a break from the boredom of my aunt's quiet house. I packed a small bag and we headed over to Sophia's place, a sprawling modern house in a gated community. Sophia had a younger brother and sister, and they lived with their mom and their stepdad, a man named Frank. The first few days of our stay were a blur of fun and excitement. We swam in their backyard pool, stayed up late watching movies, and ate junk food until we felt sick. Sophia's mom was warm and welcoming, and at first, Frank seemed to be as well. He was overly friendly, always trying to joke with us, but there was something about him that made me feel uneasy. He had a way of looking at me that was a little too intense, a little too long, and his compliments always felt like they had a hidden, unpleasant meaning. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just being sensitive. On what was supposed to be our last day there, I was all packed and ready to go home. But Maria told me that my aunt wouldn't be able to pick us up until later in the evening. That afternoon, Frank went to the store and came back with several cases of beer and a large cooler full of fresh oysters on ice. A short time later, a few of his friends came over. They were all older men like him, probably in their 40s and 50s, with loud, booming voices and beer bellies that strained against the fabric of their t-shirts. They sat up in the backyard, shucking oysters and drinking beer, the air filling with the smell of sweat and the salty brine of the shellfish. The atmosphere of the house changed instantly. The relaxed, comfortable feeling was gone, replaced by a tense, uncomfortable energy. Every time I walked past the sliding glass door to the backyard, the men would all stop talking and just stare at me. Their eyes would rake over my body, and I could feel my skin crawl under their collective gaze. Maria noticed it too. She pulled me aside and warned me to stay away from them. "They're all drunk," she whispered, her eyes wide with a seriousness that scared me. "Just stay in the house." I did as she said, making myself scarce, trying to avoid any interaction with them. At some point later in the afternoon, I found myself looking for Maria. I couldn't find her in the main part of the house, so I started down the long, narrow hallway that led to the bedrooms. As I was walking, Frank suddenly stepped out of his bedroom, blocking my path. He was drunk. I could smell the beer on his breath. I gave him a nervous smile and tried to sidle past him, but he didn't move. He just stood there, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. I laughed nervously and tried to squeeze past him again. That's when he reached out and grabbed both of my wrists. His hands were large and calloused, and his grip was surprisingly strong. He squeezed, his fingers digging into the soft skin of my wrists, the pain sharp and immediate. I was frozen with fear, my mind racing through a terrifying slideshow of worst-case scenarios. He just held me there, his eyes boring into mine, and I was too scared to scream, too scared to even breathe. It felt like an eternity, but it was probably only a few seconds. Then, from the other end of the house, I heard Maria's voice calling my name. The sound broke the spell. Frank's expression changed instantly, and he let go of my wrists as if they were red hot. He didn't say a word. I didn't wait for him to. I turned and ran, not stopping until I found Maria in the living room. I told her I wanted to go home, my voice choked with tears that I was trying desperately to hold back. When my aunt finally arrived to pick us up, I walked out of the house without looking back, but I could feel his eyes on me. I chanced a quick glance over my shoulder and saw him standing in the doorway, watching me, a cold, possessive look on his face that still haunts my nightmares. It was a Saturday night in the summer of 2023, and my friends and I were reveling in the kind of teenage freedom that only comes when parents are out of town. I was spending the night at my friend Jess's house with our other friend, Chloe. We had spent the early evening driving around town with the windows down, blasting music, and making stops at various fast food restaurants. It was a perfect, carefree night. Jess's house was the ideal spot for a sleepover. Her parents were on a weekend trip, and she had a finished basement that was our own private hangout space, complete with a comfortable couch, a big television, and a mini fridge stocked with soda. Her house was at the end of a cul-de-sac and backed up to a dense, dark patch of woods, which gave it a sense of isolation that usually felt peaceful, but was about to become terrifying. We spent a couple of hours in the basement, eating junk food and listening to music, the sound echoing in our subterranean haven. After a while, all the soda and greasy food caught up with me, and my stomach started to hurt. I told them I needed to use the bathroom. The basement didn't have one, so I had to go upstairs to the main floor of the house. I left them in the middle of a loud, laughing conversation and made my way up the stairs. The upstairs was dark and quiet, a stark contrast to the lively atmosphere of the basement. The only bathroom on the main floor was a small guest bathroom off the main hallway. The room had a small, high window right next to the toilet, which looked out into the pitch-black backyard and the impenetrable wall of trees beyond it. The moment I sat down, a wave of uneasiness washed over me. The silence of the house felt heavy, and the darkness outside the small window seemed to press in on me. I had the distinct and unsettling feeling that I was being watched. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination, my mind playing tricks on me in the unfamiliar quiet of the house. I just wanted to finish up and get back downstairs to the safety and noise of my friends. A few seconds later, my worst fear was realized. I heard a sound. It wasn't loud, just a faint, soft tapping on the window right next to my head. Tick, tick, tick. It sounded like a small twig or a branch hitting the glass. I froze, my heart instantly starting to pound in my chest. I wanted to scream, to call out for my friends, but I was afraid of giving away my position to whoever, or whatever, was outside. I remembered, with a sinking feeling, that I had left my cell phone downstairs in the basement. I was trapped. The tapping stopped. I sat there, holding my breath, straining my ears to hear any other sounds. Then it came again, this time harder, more deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. There was no mistaking it now. It wasn't a branch. Someone was out there, intentionally tapping on the window. I was trembling with fear, trying to finish up as quickly as possible. Just then, I heard Jess's footsteps coming down the hall. She knocked on the bathroom door, her voice loud and cheerful. "Hey, hurry up. I have to go real bad." Her voice was both a comfort and a terror. I was so relieved that she was there, but I was also terrified that her loud voice would alert the person outside to our presence. I tried to shush her from the other side of the door, my voice a panicked whisper. Right after I shushed her, the tapping happened for a third time, loud and insistent. By some miracle, Jess heard it too. She went silent on the other side of the door. I finally finished up, jumped off the toilet, and unlocked the door. I grabbed Jess's arm, my eyes wide with fear, and practically dragged her back down to the basement with me, locking the door at the top of the stairs behind us. We stumbled back into the basement, and I explained to a now terrified Chloe what had happened. They both believed me immediately. The fact that Jess had heard the tapping too removed any doubt. We were all completely freaked out. We tried to rationalize it, to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe it was an animal or a neighbor playing a prank. But we all knew, deep down, that it was something more sinister. We decided to stay in the locked basement for the rest of the night. We put on a movie, turning the volume up loud to drown out any other sounds, and tried to distract ourselves. But the fear lingered, a cold, heavy presence in the room. We eventually fell into a restless, uneasy sleep, huddled together on the couch. We were jolted awake by a loud, violent pounding coming from somewhere upstairs. It wasn't just a knock. It was the sound of someone throwing their full body weight against the door. The back patio door was being shaken in its frame, the sound echoing through the entire house. Chloe and Jess started screaming, their hysterical cries filling the basement and shattering any hope we had of remaining hidden. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the banging stopped. The house fell completely silent. We stayed quiet for a long time, listening, our hearts pounding in our chests. Eventually, we convinced ourselves that we had to go upstairs and look. We needed to know if he was gone. We crept up the stairs together, armed with makeshift weapons, a heavy lamp, a fire poker from the fireplace. We tiptoed into the kitchen, which had a large window that looked out onto the back deck. At first, we didn't see anything. The backyard was a sea of blackness. We moved closer to the window, our faces pressed against the cool glass, trying to see if anyone was out there. And then, a man's face lunged out of the darkness and slammed itself against the window, just inches from ours. He was pale and gaunt, with wide, manic eyes and a grotesque, silent scream on his face. We all screamed and scrambled backwards, falling over each other in our haste to get away. We ran back to the basement, barricading the door this time with a heavy bookshelf. We called Jess's parents, and they called the police. We waited in the basement, terrified, listening for any other sounds, until we finally saw the flashing red and blue lights of the police cars through the high basement windows. The police searched the entire property. They found footprints all around the house and deep smudge marks on both the bathroom and kitchen windows. But the man was long gone. I've always been a jumpy person. My friends make fun of me for it, calling me paranoid, but I just call it being prepared. I'm the guy who always checks the back seat of his car before getting in, the one who notices when a door that's usually closed is slightly ajar. It's a habit that's earned me some eye rolls, but one that has also made me feel a little safer in a world that often feels unpredictable. It's why, when I packed my bag for a sleepover at my best friend Noah's house in the winter of 2023, I slipped a small, foldable lock-back knife into the side pocket of my backpack. It was a simple utility knife, nothing fancy, but the solid weight of it in my hand was a small comfort. I never thought I would actually have to use it. Noah's family had just moved into a new house a few months prior. It was one of those modern two-story homes in a newly developed suburb with an open concept ground floor and a finished basement that was designated as our weekend sanctuary. That night, it was just me, Noah, and his younger brother, Sam, who was about 10. Their parents were upstairs in their bedroom, and their older brother, Liam, was in his room across the hall from Noah's. We had spent the evening in the basement, fueled by pizza and an obscene amount of soda, playing video games until our eyes burned. Around 2 in the morning, we finally gave up and spread our sleeping bags out on a plush carpet. The house was quiet, the only sounds being the low hum of the furnace and Sam's soft, rhythmic breathing from the other side of the room. I woke up to a sound that didn't belong. It was a muffled thud from upstairs, followed by a sharp, choked-off cry. I lay perfectly still in the darkness, my heart starting to hammer against my ribs. I strained my ears, listening. For a moment, there was nothing, and I started to convince myself that I had just been dreaming. Maybe one of Noah's parents had dropped something or bumped into a piece of furniture on their way to the bathroom. But then I heard it again, a sound of a struggle, a man's voice raised in a pained grunt, and then, unmistakably, the sound of Noah's mom screaming. It was a raw, terrified sound that sliced through the silence of the house and sent a jolt of pure ice through my veins. Both Noah and I shot up at the same time. His eyes were wide with a mixture of confusion and fear. "What was that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The scream came again, this time louder, more desperate. I didn't hesitate. Adrenaline surged through me, overriding any sense of fear. I scrambled over to my backpack, my fingers fumbling with the zipper in the dark. I pulled out the knife, the cool metal a stark contrast to my sweaty palm. I clicked the blade into place. "Stay here with Sam," I told Noah, my voice coming out as a harsh whisper. "Lock the basement door and call 911. He nodded, his face pale, and grabbed his phone from the coffee table. I crept up the basement stairs, my knife held tightly in front of me. Every creak of the wooden steps sounded deafeningly loud. When I reached the top, I could hear the sounds of a violent struggle coming from the end of the hallway, near the master bedroom. There was shouting, the splintering sound of wood and heavy, rhythmic impacts that made the floor vibrate slightly. I peered around the corner of the staircase and saw a scene of pure chaos. A man I had never seen before, dressed in dark clothing with a ski mask pulled over his face, was thrashing wildly in the hallway. Noah's dad and his older brother, Liam, were trying to subdue him. Liam had a metal baseball bat and was swinging it with desperate force, while their dad was trying to wrestle the man to the ground. The intruder was fighting back like a cornered animal, kicking and punching. Then I saw the glint of metal in the intruder's hand. He had a knife, much larger than mine, and he was swinging it wildly. Without thinking, I ran from the shadows of the staircase and threw myself into the fray. I drove my shoulder into the man's side, the impact sending him staggering against the wall. He grunted in surprise, his head whipping around to look at me. For a split second, his dark eyes, visible through the holes in his mask, met mine. They were filled with a terrifying combination of rage and panic. He raised his knife towards me, and I reacted on pure instinct, bringing my own knife up to defend myself. In that same moment, Liam brought the baseball bat down hard across the man's arm. There was a sickening crack, and the intruder cried out in pain, the knife clattering to the floor. Noah's dad seized the opportunity and tackled him, driving him to the ground. The three of us pinned him there, the fight draining out of him as he groaned in pain. It was only then, in the sudden ringing silence that followed, that I saw the blood. There was a dark spreading stain on the carpet, and Sam, Noah's little brother, was lying in the doorway of his room, clutching his side, his face a mask of shock and pain. The man had stabbed him during the struggle. The next few minutes were a blur of panicked shouting. Noah's mom on the phone with the 911 operator, and me pressing my jacket against Sam's wound, trying to stop the bleeding. The wail of approaching sirens was the most reassuring sound I had ever heard. The police and paramedics arrived in what felt like seconds, and the house was suddenly filled with uniforms and a controlled, professional chaos. They cuffed the intruder and led him away, and the paramedics carefully loaded Sam onto a stretcher. The rest of the night was spent at the police station, giving statements, and then at the hospital, waiting for news about Sam. He had been stabbed a few times, but luckily, the knife had missed any vital organs. He would be okay. The police later told us that the man was a local drifter with a long criminal record. He had been watching the house for a few days, waiting for an opportunity. He was charged with breaking and entering an attempted murder. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Noah called me a few weeks after it happened to tell me Sam was out of the hospital and recovering well. We didn't talk about what had happened that night. We didn't need to. I still have the knife, but I don't carry it with me anymore. I don't need the physical reminder. The memory of that night is a weight I will carry with me forever. In October of 2024, for my friend Olivia's 14th birthday, her parents agreed to let her have a small sleepover with just her closest friends. There were 5 of us in total, crammed into her cozy, attic-like bedroom in her old New England home. The house itself had a reputation in our town for being mildly haunted, a rumor that Olivia's family mostly laughed off, but one that we, as teenagers with a flair for the dramatic, fully embraced. We had spent the first few hours of the night watching horror movies, each one scarier than the last, until we were all huddled together under a single blanket, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. It was during a particularly tense moment in a slasher film that Olivia got an idea. Her eyes lit up with a mischievous glee. "I know what we should do," she announced, pausing the movie. She disappeared into her closet and emerged a moment later, holding a dusty, vintage-looking Ouija board. She had found it in a box of her grandmother's old things in the attic. A wave of nervous excitement washed over the group. We had all heard stories about Ouija boards, cautionary tales of people contacting malevolent spirits and inviting darkness into their homes. But the thrill of the forbiddance was too strong to resist. We gathered in a circle on the floor, placing the board in the center. Olivia lit a few candles, their flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows on the walls and making the room feel like a secret, sacred space. We all placed 2 fingers lightly on the planchette, the small heart-shaped piece of wood that would supposedly serve as our connection to the spirit world. The first few questions were the typical, silly teenage fare. Does my crush like me back? Will I pass my algebra test? The planchette moved slowly, almost reluctantly, spelling out vague, nonsensical answers that we all giggled at. But as the night wore on and our initial giddiness gave way to a more serious curiosity, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. "Is there anyone in this room with us?" One of my friends asked, her voice a hushed whisper. For a long moment, the planchette remained still. Then, it began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing speed and confidence. It slid to the word "yes" at the top of the board. A collective gasp went through our group. The air in the room suddenly felt colder, heavier. "What is your name?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The planchette moved again, this time spelling out a single chilling word: Zozo. I had never heard the name before, but a deep, primal sense of dread washed over me. The planchette started moving more erratically, spelling out a series of threatening, disjointed phrases. Get out. You are not welcome. I will hurt you. I started to feel a strange prickling sensation on my back, as if 1,000 tiny needles were pressing into my skin. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my nerves. But the sensation intensified, growing into a hot, burning pain that spread across my entire back. It felt like someone was holding a hot poker against my skin. I cried out, pulling my hands away from the planchette as if I had been burned. What's wrong? Olivia asked, her face etched with concern. I couldn't speak. Tears were streaming down my face from the sheer intensity of the pain. I told them my back was burning. My friends exchanged worried glances. One of them gently lifted the back of my t-shirt. There was a sharp, collective intake of breath. I twisted my neck, trying to see what they were looking at. In the reflection of Olivia's vanity mirror, I saw it. 3 long, angry red lines ran diagonally across my back, from my left shoulder down to my right hip. They were perfectly parallel, as if they had been raked there by a giant, 3-fingered claw. Small beads of blood were welling up along the length of the scratches. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of terror through the room. Olivia screamed and grabbed a Ouija board, throwing it across the room where it clattered against the wall. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in her bed, with every light in the room turned on, too scared to even close our eyes. The next morning, the scratches were still there, a painful, physical reminder of the night before. They eventually faded into thin, white scars, a permanent memento of the night we decided to play a game with something we didn't understand. It's strange how a simple, everyday object, like a phone, can transform from a gateway to your friends into a source of pure dread. That's what happened to me in the fall of 2023. I was 16, living a perfectly normal life in a small, quiet town in Ohio where nothing much ever happened. I had a great group of friends, a steady boyfriend named Alex, and the usual teenage anxieties about homework and curfews. That all changed one Tuesday evening. I was in my room trying to finish a history paper when my phone buzzed with a call from a number I didn't recognize. My first instinct was to ignore it, assuming it was just another spam call about my car's extended warranty. But for some reason, I answered it. "Hello?" I said, my voice hesitant. The line was silent for a moment, and then a man's voice, deep and gravelly, like stone being dragged across concrete, spoke my name. "Hello, Jessica." A cold shiver traced its way down my spine. It wasn't just that he knew my name. It was the way he said it, with a chilling familiarity that made my skin crawl. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He chuckled, a low, guttural sound that held no humor. "That's not important right now," he said. "What is important is where Alex is. Is he with you?" My blood ran cold. He knew my boyfriend's name. My mind raced, trying to place the voice. Was it one of Alex's friends playing a stupid prank? An ex-boyfriend trying to mess with me? But the voice was completely unfamiliar, and there was a menacing edge to it that felt all too real. "I don't know who this is," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "but you need to leave me alone." He ignored me. "You're a very pretty girl, Jessica," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It would be a shame if something happened to that pretty face. If you don't do exactly what I say, I'm going to come and take you away for a long, long time." That's when I hung up. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely press the red button on the screen. I immediately blocked the number and tried to put it out of my mind, telling myself it was just a sick prank. But the feeling of violation lingered. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text message from a different number. It read, "Hanging up was a bad choice. I know where you live." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I ran downstairs and told my mom everything. She was concerned, but she agreed that it was probably just a prank. She told me to keep blocking the numbers and that they would eventually get bored and stop. For a while, it seemed like she was right. Weeks went by and then months with no more calls or texts. The memory of the deep, gravelly voice began to fade, and I started to feel safe again. Then, about 6 months later, it started again. It was a Saturday night, and I was at home watching a movie. Another unknown number. This time, I almost didn't answer, but a morbid curiosity got the better of me. It was the same voice. "Did you miss me, Jessica?" he asked, the same chilling familiarity in his tone. This time, he was angrier, more insistent. The questions were the same, but his threats were more graphic, more detailed. He started sending me pictures of myself, photos that were clearly pulled from my private Instagram account, an account I only shared with my closest friends. Seeing my own smiling face sent back to me by this anonymous monster felt like a profound violation. It was a clear message. I can see you. I can get to you. It was late, around 11 at night, when I heard a car horn blaring outside my house. It wasn't just a quick beep. It was a long, sustained blast that went on for a good 15 seconds, an angry, piercing sound that shattered the quiet of our peaceful street. I ran to my window and peeked through the blinds. A dark-colored sedan was idling at the curb, its headlights off. As I watched, it suddenly sped off, its tires squealing on the pavement. I was terrified. He wasn't just a voice on the phone anymore. He was real, and he was right outside my house. We called the police this time. My cousin happened to be a deputy in the local sheriff's department. He came over, took a report, but he was frustratingly dismissive. He told me it was probably just a kid with a crush, that I should just block the number and not give them the attention they were so clearly desperate for. He said there was nothing they could do without more evidence. The calls stopped again after that, but the fear didn't. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every unfamiliar sound. A few weeks later, my best friend, Jenna, came over for a sleepover. We were trying to have a normal night, watching movies and eating junk food, pretending that everything was okay. My phone started ringing. This time, it was a blocked number. No caller ID displayed on the screen. Before I could stop her, Jenna grabbed the phone and answered it, thinking it was her mom. Her cheerful, "Hello?" was met with a chilling silence, and then the gravelly voice spoke my name. I saw the color drain from Jenna's face. She handed the phone to me, her hand trembling. "It's him," she whispered. The voice on the other end was filled with a cold, simmering rage. He was furious that someone else had answered. "Who gets to you first, Cha-Cha? Me or the cops?" He snarled, a phrase that sent a familiar wave of terror through me. He started making vile demands, telling me that if I didn't send him explicit photos of myself, he would find Jenna and do something terrible to her. The thought of him hurting my friend, who was now sitting next to me, crying silently, was unbearable. He was relentless. Every time I hung up, he would call back immediately. My phone was buzzing and ringing nonstop, a constant, unbearable assault. At one point, Jenna, through her tears, whispered that she thought she knew who it might be, a chilling statement that opened up a whole new realm of terrifying possibilities. The calls just kept coming, a constant barrage of threats and abuse. And then, my phone just gave out. The screen flickered, turned a bright electric blue, and then went black. The relentless calls had literally broken it. The silence that followed was both a relief and a new source of terror. He was still out there, and now I had no way of knowing when he might call again. Before I tell you what happened, I need you to understand what I was like at 13. This was back in 2018. I was a quiet, awkward girl, the kind who spends her lunch period in the library, more comfortable with the characters in books than with the loud, confusing world of middle school social hierarchies. I was a blank slate, desperate for connection, for someone to see me and tell me I was worth seeing. And then, Isabel found me. She was everything I wasn't. Charismatic, confident, beautiful, and a little bit dangerous. When she decided I was going to be her best friend, it felt like the sun had chosen to shine directly on me. For the first time in my life, I felt special. Our friendship was intense from the very beginning. We were inseparable, sharing secrets, inside jokes, our entire lives. But looking back, I can see the red flags, the subtle, creeping signs of the darkness that lay beneath her charming exterior. It started with a quiet, insidious form of isolation. She would make cutting remarks about my other friends, twisting their words, inventing slights, until I found myself pulling away from them, until she was the only one I had left. My world became very small, with Isabel at its center. Then came the physical part. It was never a punch or a slap. Her abuse was more subtle, more confusing, a twisted performance disguised as a game. We were both heavily into fandoms and role-playing, and she would use this as her cover. It always happened in public, usually at our crowded lunch table in the middle of the school cafeteria, which made it all the more violating and confusing. It would start with her hand on my thigh under the table, a possessive, proprietary gesture. Then, she would insist we role-play. Her role-plays were never about the characters or the story. They were just an excuse to touch me. She would press her body against mine, kiss my neck, run her hands over my chest, all while whispering lines from some anime or movie. I would freeze, my body rigid with a shame and confusion so profound I couldn't speak. I didn't know what to call what she was doing, but I knew it felt wrong. It made my skin crawl. Afterward, she would either laugh it off as if it were all a hilarious joke, or she would turn it on me, her voice laced with a strange, mocking accusation, blaming my supposed eroticism for her behavior. She was breaking me down, piece by piece, and convincing me that it was my fault. The abuse reached a horrifying new level at her 13th birthday party. It was a sleepover at her house, a sprawling modern home in an affluent suburb that always felt cold and sterile to me, despite its size. I was filled with a familiar low-grade dread, but the thought of not going, of incurring her wrath, was even more terrifying. The first few hours were a performance of teenage fun. We ate pizza, sang karaoke horribly off-key, and drank soda, pretending it was alcohol. Isabel's parents were there, a distant, smiling presence, but her father, a stern, imposing man, left for his night shift as a security guard around 10 o'clock. The moment the front door clicked shut behind him, the atmosphere in the house shifted. Isabel's smile took on a sharp, predatory edge. Her older sister, Chloe, who was 15 and a carbon copy of Isabel in both looks and cruelty, came into the living room where we were all gathered. Isabel disappeared into the basement for a moment and returned holding a DVD case. My stomach plummeted when I saw the title, The Human Centipede. My mom had a very short list of movies I was strictly forbidden from watching until I was an adult, and that was at the very top. She knew I was sensitive, easily disturbed by things involving body horror and human suffering. I calmly tried to explain this to Isabel. "I can't watch that," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "My mom would kill me. I really don't want to." The other girls at the party looked uncomfortable, but Isabel and Chloe just smiled. They began to plead and cajole, their voices dripping with a false sweetness. "Oh, come on, don't be a baby," Isabel cooed. "It's just a movie." I kept refusing, my resolve hardening with each denial. "No," I said, my voice a little stronger. "I'm not watching it." Isabel's sweet facade shattered. Her face contorted into a mask of cold fury. "Yes, you are," she hissed. Before I could react, she grabbed my wrists. She was surprisingly strong, her fingers digging into my skin like talons. "You won't have a choice," she said, her voice a low, menacing growl. She and Chloe began to drag me across the room towards the large leather couch in front of the television. I struggled, pleading with them to let me go, my voice cracking with a mixture of fear and humiliation. They just mimicked my cries in high-pitched, mocking tones. They threw me onto the couch, and as I tried to get up, Chloe produced a pair of real, honest-to-God police handcuffs. Their mother was a police officer, and with a shocking lack of responsibility, had left them in a drawer in the entertainment center. The cold, heavy metal clamped shut over my wrists with a series of sharp clicks. I thrashed, the cuffs biting into my skin, but it was useless. Isabel leaned in close, her face just inches from mine, her hands cupping my cheeks in a gesture that was anything but gentle. "You scream," she whispered, her voice a terrifyingly calm threat. "And I will cut your tongue out," I believed her. I went completely silent, my body rigid with terror, and so I watched the movie. I won't describe the details of what I saw on that screen. The premise is infamous for a reason, but I can tell you what it felt like. It felt like a piece of my soul was being carved out of me with a rusty knife. I dissociated, my mind retreating to a numb, empty place where the horrifying images and sounds couldn't fully penetrate. I was a mess, tears streaming silently down my face, my body trembling uncontrollably. All the while, Isabel and Chloe sat on either side of me, laughing. When the movie was finally over, they uncuffed me. I was a shell, just a hollowed-out version of the girl who had arrived at the party a few hours earlier. "I want to go home," I repeated over and over, my voice a monotone drone. They just laughed at me, as if my trauma was the most hilarious thing they had ever witnessed. They went upstairs to bed, leaving me alone in the dark, silent living room. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers clumsy and numb. 30 minutes later, my dad's headlights cut through the darkness of the street. I grabbed my things and left without a word, without a single look back. The car ride home was silent. I couldn't speak. The next day, after hours of my parents' gentle, worried questioning, the story finally came out, a torrent of sobs and fragmented sentences. I have never seen my mother so angry. Her face was a mask of pure, cold fury. She drove to Isabel's house and confronted their mother, who pulled the two girls out onto the front lawn and screamed at them for what felt like an eternity before making them run laps around the block until they were both red-faced and gasping for air. But the punishment didn't matter. The damage was done. The friendship, if it could ever have been called that, was over. But the fear, the shame, and the memory of that night still haunt me, a permanent stain on the landscape of my memory. My house in rural Pennsylvania is my sanctuary. It's set on a few acres of land, and the backyard is bordered by a vast, dense forest that stretches for miles. The centerpiece of our backyard is the swimming pool, a patch of bright, inviting blue against the deep, dark green of the woods. In the summer, my friends and I practically live in that pool. On a hot, sticky night in August of last year, I had a few friends over for a sleepover. There were 5 of us in total, all teenage girls between the ages of 13 and 15. Around 8:30, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, we decided to go for a night swim. There's a certain magic to swimming at night. The water feels warmer, the air cooler, and the world seems to shrink down to just the illuminated circle of the pool. But that night, as the last vestiges of daylight faded and the woods behind the pool cage transformed into an impenetrable wall of blackness, the magic began to curdle into a feeling of unease. We were all starting to get a really eerie feeling, a sense that we were being watched from the darkness of the trees. We tried to ignore it, our laughter a little too loud, a little too forced as we splashed around, playing Marco Polo. It was during a quiet moment in the game that my friend Jenna suddenly went still. "Did you guys hear that?" she whispered. We all stopped what we were doing and listened. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the water against the sides of the pool. "I heard something rustling in the woods," she said, her eyes wide as she stared into the darkness. I told her it was probably just a deer or a raccoon, a common sound in our neck of the woods. We went back to our game, but the seed of fear had been planted. A few minutes later, Jenna grabbed my arm. "I swear I just saw something move," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. We all fell silent again, our eyes scanning the dark tree line. We saw nothing. We heard nothing. It was dead silent. After about an hour, the nervous energy had dissipated, and we were all just floating on rafts, talking and laughing, the earlier scare forgotten. That's when we heard it. A single, clear, melodic whistle, coming from somewhere deep in the woods. It wasn't a bird, it was distinctly human. We all shot up, our heads whipping around to face the woods, our eyes wide, searching for the source of the sound. The woods remained dark and silent. And then, it happened again. The same whistle, but this time, it sounded closer. We were terrified. We slowly, quietly slipped off our rafts and exited the pool, our eyes never leaving the tree line. The whistle kept coming, a steady rhythmic sound that seemed to be moving through the trees, getting closer and closer with each note. We ran into the house, slamming and locking the sliding glass door behind us. We retreated to my bedroom, which was at the front of the house, as far away from the backyard as possible. We got changed and tried to distract ourselves with a movie, but we were all too shaken up. About 15 minutes into the movie, the whistling started again, but this time, it wasn't coming from the backyard. It was coming from right outside my bedroom window. We all froze, the sound of the movie fading into the background as we strained our ears. The whistling was accompanied by a soft, rhythmic tapping on the window pane. Whatever or whoever had been in the woods had followed us. We all lay there on my bed, huddled together under a blanket, too scared to even breathe. The tapping on the window grew more insistent, turning into a harsh, angry banging. That's when my friend Dana, her hands shaking, called 911. It felt like we waited for hours for the police to arrive, but in reality, it was only about 5 minutes. The moment we heard the faint wail of approaching sirens, everything went quiet. The banging stopped. The whistling stopped. When the police arrived and swept the property with their flashlights, they found nothing. The person was gone, but lying in the soft dirt of the flower bed, right beneath my bedroom window, was a large, sharp kitchen knife, its blade glinting in the beam of the officer's flashlight. I remember my 10th birthday in 2015, like it was yesterday. The day was a blur of cake, presents, and the chaotic energy that only a house full of 10-year-olds can create. As the party wound down and parents started arriving to pick up their kids, my best friend, Emily, and my 2 older siblings, Mark and Charlene, were getting ready for the main event, the sleepover. The highlight of any birthday for me was the sleepover that followed, and this year, we had decided to up the ante. We were going to play hide and seek in the dark. Our house was perfect for it. It was a large, rambling structure with multiple staircases, long hallways, and a confusing layout that made it an ideal playing field for a game like this. Mark, being the oldest, was designated as the seeker. He went down the hall to the guest bathroom to count to 100, his voice echoing through the quiet house. The rest of us scattered, our bare feet slapping against the hardwood floors as we scrambled to find the perfect hiding spot. I decided to head downstairs to the main living room. It was a large, dimly lit space, filled with oversized furniture that cast long, distorted shadows in the faint light filtering in from the streetlights outside. My cousin, Rick, who had come for the party, was passed out on the large sofa, his soft snores filling the otherwise silent room. I figured the best hiding spot would be behind the couch. It was a dark, narrow space, completely hidden from view. I squeezed myself into the space between the back of the couch and the wall and crouched down, making myself as small as possible. A few moments later, I felt someone else slide into the space next to me. I assumed it was Emily. "Good spot," I whispered, a giggle escaping my lips. The person next to me whispered back, but their voice was strange, a low, raspy sound that didn't sound like Emily at all. "The best," the voice rasped. Rick, on the couch, stirred in his sleep and started mumbling incoherently. The person next to me placed a hand on my shoulder as if to steady me. That's when I felt it. The hand was ice cold, and the fingers were long and bony, with sharp, jagged nails that dug slightly into my shoulder. A wave of confusion and fear washed over me. I slowly turned my head to look at the person next to me. It wasn't Emily. The thing crouched next to me was something out of a nightmare. It had pale, almost translucent skin, and its face was dominated by 2 enormous, black, wet-looking eyes that seemed to swallow the dim light. It had a lipless mouth that was stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I was frozen, paralyzed with a terror so pure and absolute that it felt like my heart had stopped beating. The creature's grin widened, and it let out a soft, guttural chuckle. That sound broke the spell. A primal scream ripped from my throat as I scrambled out from behind the couch, knocking over a lamp in my haste. The creature skittered after me, moving unnaturally fast on all fours, its long, sharp claws scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. I ran for my life, a blur of motion and pure, unadulterated terror. I could hear it right behind me as I flew up the stairs. I burst into my brother's room, where everyone had designated as the safe zone, and slammed the door shut just as the creature threw itself against the other side with a loud thud. Everyone came rushing over to me, asking me what had happened. I was hysterical, babbling incoherently about the creature behind the couch. At first, they didn't believe me, thinking I had just gotten scared in the dark. According to Emily, she had been hiding in the dining room the entire time. Then, Charlene pointed to my back. "Kayla, you're bleeding," she said, her voice filled with alarm. Mark lifted up the back of my t-shirt. There, running from my right shoulder down to the left side of my back, were 4 long, deep scratch marks welling up with blood. The sight of the scratches turned everyone's fear into a horrifying reality. The game was over. We all huddled together in the room, too scared to even move. After a while, my brother decided we needed to clean the cuts on my back. He and I cautiously opened the bedroom door and stepped out into the hallway. The house was completely silent. As we made our way towards the bathroom, we both saw it at the same time. Down the long hallway, a head slowly peeked out from the doorway of our parents' bedroom. It was pure white, and it seemed to glow with a faint, ethereal light. It had no features, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, and its neck was unnaturally long and thin. It held its position for a moment, as if observing us, and then slowly retracted back into the darkness of the room. We both screamed and ran back into the safety of my brother's room, slamming the door shut once again. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, not daring to leave the room until the sun came up. The next morning, as I was getting changed, Charlene checked my back. The scratches were completely gone. There wasn't even a faint red line or a scar. It was just smooth, unbroken skin, as if they had never been there at all.